Hi, everyone. My name is Carlos Montero. I've met with a number of you, I'm sure, over the course of these 5 years and working with Natasha and working with the Mass Department of Corrections. We've learned quite a bit in this research. So I'm here to talk about phase 2, to introduce the focus group's results and to also introduce the results from the officer interviews. So in phase 2, what we wanted to do was to include a bit that was missing in some of our past research with correctional officers. In our last study, we worked on a research study on correctional officer stress, and in that work, we learned quite a bit, and we learned that many of you talked about one of the main sources of stress being the administration, being your supervisors. So one of the reasons why we included focus groups with supervisors and administrators was to get at that particular component there. We wanted to find out a little bit more about what administrators and supervisors had to say, how they felt about correctional officer well-being altogether, and what their sort of understanding and sort of emphasis on correctional suicide would be. And so in addition to the interviews that we did with friends and families, we wanted to have qualitative interviews with the command staff, with administrators, with supervisors. And so we held these hour-long meetings with particularly sort of supervisors that included captains, lieutenants, directors of securities, and superintendents from across the department. Now, we didn't get to meet everyone, so you see some of the findings here. We conducted specifically 22 administrator, supervisor, and special community focus groups. And in these focus groups, they range from 1 to 7 people that participated in each of the focus groups. And again, our objective in the focus groups was to better understand the impacts of the officer suicides on the institutional environment, and also on the challenge of responding to officer suicides as supervisors, right? How do they feel about approaching, having these conversations with their staff, helping the staff deal with the particular loss, and then just running the organization as a whole. So in total, we had a total of about 59 people that participated in these focus groups, in these interviews. 32 were Mass DOC administrators, and 27 were captains and lieutenants that participated. 36 of the 59 participants, which made up about 61%, also completed a phase 2 interview, which I'll talk about briefly before turning over to Natasha. And in the focus groups themselves, we had sort of a list of questions that we wanted to get across, but these conversations really sort of free flowed into a number of different areas. And so we had these 3 primary focus group questions, as you see them there listed, but we wanted to get an understanding of how supervisors are dealing with the challenges of managing their staff. So on our first questions, what are the greatest challenges you face as a supervisor in training and supporting the officers you oversee in areas of correctional officer well-being and wellness? The second question there, have you noticed any significant changes in the work environment or in your colleagues' attitudes towards work over the past few years? And then the last question that's really sort of garnered quite a bit of responses, how has the Department of Correction addressed the problem of correctional officer suicide in the aftermath of known suicide? So as you can imagine, these conversations were intense. There were quite a bit that came out of these conversations, but we really wanted to sort of hone in on a few key themes that emerged from the conversations themselves. And so we had 6 major themes. And so throughout these conversations, throughout these discussions, participants, again, that included captains, lieutenants, and superintendents. And we also had other administrators. Specifically, we included conversations with members of the EASU. We also included conversations with members of the trauma committee, which I believe they've changed their names now. But throughout these conversations, they repeatedly talked about specific challenges that came from, things such as staffing shortages, mandatory overtime, absenteeism, policy changes, right? Policy shifts that have taken place. We've noted some of the differences themselves between our last research, when mandatory overtime was not really a major sort of was not really called for. It wasn't really in high demand. And in this research, which took place between 2017 and 2019, where mandatory overtime was very much a key piece of, or was very much happening throughout the department. And so of the theme of the major themes that came out, we have these 6 themes here that the supervisors, the administrators really talked about. And you can see, you know, number 1 there talked about generational differences. This is discussed across all of the focus groups with administrators, with supervisors. They talked about the new staff coming in, the recruitment that's taking place. And this is, again, you can imagine, this is a conversation that we hear not just in our field in correction or in the corrections themselves, but in other fields, even I teach at the university, and I talk about some of the younger students and the differences that I see as, you know, in the new students as opposed to when I was a student themselves. And that's some of the key differences that we noticed that came out of these conversations. So for example, the supervisors talked about the incoming class, the incoming recruits being complex, being needy, having more requests, not really being able to cut it, not really being able to sort of make it through the training, making through as an officer. Another major theme that came out of these conversations was management style differences, right? So we had some some officers, some of the supervisors talked about, you know, just differences between how lieutenants, sergeants, how some supervisors, some superintendents manage, how some superintendents demand certain responsibilities out of their staff, and some others do not. Another major theme that came out was promotion stress and really some of the unclear department policies that were sort of talked about, right? Again, there was not one major policy that talked about what you should do as a supervisor when the suicide took place in your department, in your facility, right? There wasn't sort of a clear-cut sort of definition as what you should do as captain in response to sort of a major incident or major trauma that took place in your facility. Also, in number 4 that you see, inadequate training and resources was discussed quite often. Opposition to help seeking and concerns about confidentiality, that was also a major theme that came out. And lastly, we see calls for more proactive approaches to officer well-being. So, you know, in all, the supervisors, the administrators they noticed some of the same problems that we also found in the interviews that you're going to hear about shortly, and when Natasha talked about. They also talked about challenges in terms of how the department makes it, you know, a bit difficult in sort of having a clear message as to what you should do, how officers are supposed to be treated, what should be as a policy if an officer is facing a particular challenge, had a difficulty at home. So there are a number of differences, a number of challenges discussed there. So before I turn it over to Natasha about the officer interviews, I will say that, so all in all, these are the 6 major themes that came out of these focus group conversations. And now I'm gonna pause and actually turn the conversation over to Natasha, who will talk about the findings from the office interviews themselves.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Carlos, for presenting on the focus groups. I'm going to turn now to the officer interviews, which many of you who are watching this may have participated in. Again, after the phase 1 case studies, we went back into the department. We did interviews with supervisors and administrators in a focus group context, but we also did 440 one-on-one interviews with employees of the department. I'll talk about the 3 groups, but I'll emphasize that these findings we present mainly focus on this first group, which were 319 sworn officers at all ranks who were randomly selected. And that's important because what we find among these officers is actually representative of all of the officers in the department. Secondly, we interviewed new recruits. Just as we were beginning interviews, the department graduated an academy, one of the first academies in a couple of years. And so we took that opportunity to interview new recruits, primarily because we knew whatever we found among officers, someone would say, well, how do you know that they didn't come in like that? How do you know that this career doesn't attract people with high levels of PTSD, anxiety, depression, or whatnot? And so although it doesn't definitively answer that question, we knew that if we at least had some baseline measures among new recruits, we'd be able to speak to that question specifically a little bit better than we would be able to without the new recruits. Importantly, that actually led to our next study, as I'll talk about at the very end. And then as importantly, we interviewed 76 volunteers. And these were, as I mentioned at the outset of the presentation, the focus group participants people who simply came forward and volunteered, and also friends of the officers who had died by suicide. Most, but not all of these volunteers were sworn officers. So that's where we get our non-sworn population from. Here again, I focus on the random samples because they are representative of the populations that they are representing. So in the first group, the sworn officers across the department, and the second group, new recruits. And here we focus on the impacts of the suicides on the health and well-being of the officers who still work for the department. This slide has got a lot of numbers on it. It just really goes to show we had a population of about 3,300 officers who worked for the department at the time in which the department gave us the list of sworn employees. We selected a sample. As you can see, our sample was randomly selected, so it looks very like the population of sworn officers. And then finally, the folks who agreed to interviews on the far right there look very like the people in this overall sample itself. So this is just a slide that demonstrates that this is a random sample, but also a very representative sample. So what we find among this group really can speak to the population of officers currently working for the department. I like to start this part by noting that suicide exposures across the department are substantial. This probably is pretty obvious given that there were so many suicides in such a short period of time, but those exposures to suicide are pretty important in what we find around the mental health and well-being of officers. So 2/3 of the officers we interviewed in the random sample were who are currently working for the department, reported having personally known at least one officer who died by suicide. So that's 2/3 of all the employees who work for the department personally knew one of the officers who had died. Again, this will become important when we look at the impacts on their own mental health and well-being. The officers who work for the department are also incredibly concerned about this issue. So they're concerned both about the mental health and well-being of their colleagues generally, and they are very specifically concerned about the risk for suicide. We asked them questions that put the level of concern on a scale of 1 to 10, asking first, how concerned are you about the emotional and psychological health of the other officers you work with? And here you can see that they rated their concern as an almost 8 out of 10, so very high. They were very concerned. For 1/3 of the officers actually literally indicated that their level of concern was a 10. In other words, one in 3 officers, they have the highest level of concern about their colleagues. We asked a very similar question about how concerned you are about officer suicide more specifically. And here you see even more concern expressed. So the average was 8.3 out of 10, but more than half of the officers who currently work for the department reported that their level of concern was a 10, like the highest possible level of concern. And so you can see not only are they exposed to suicide, but they're also concerned about suicide and officer well-being more generally. Crucially, about 1/3 of the officers we interviewed indicated that another correction officer had talked to them about suicide specifically in a way that made them concerned for the officer's safety. So in other words, 1/3 of the officers felt someone was acutely at risk because someone had talked to them about suicide. We asked, what percentage of the people you work with are you concerned about their emotional health, such as their mental health, their interpersonal well-being in terms of their relationships, and also their behavioral well-being in terms of their substance use, insomnia, just how well they're doing physically overall. And you can see that levels of concern are pretty high. So on average, the officers reported being concerned about almost half of the people they work with. So 44%, 44%, and 48%. So not only are officers concerned about well-being and suicide, but very specifically, they think that almost half of the people they work with are experiencing the types of problems that we saw as important in the officer suicides themselves. I also like to speak more specifically about the mental health outcomes. And here it's important to note that we use the TSI-II, which is the Trauma Symptom Inventory. It is a highly validated way to assess the sort of range of mental health issues that participants are going through. There are different ranges of scores. And so there's sort of normal range scores on each of these measures, but there's also a way to figure out whether someone is in the category of problematic symptomology or clinically elevated symptomology. And those are two important categories because someone who is expressing problematic levels of this problem would likely need to be seen by a psychologist, and clinically elevated almost certainly so. So these are the people you should be very concerned about. And as you can see, among the officers that we interviewed, there were relatively high percentages who acknowledged experiencing symptoms of these mental health issues, anger, anxiety, which here is referred to as anxious arousal, post-traumatic stress, again, 1 in 5, depression, and specifically suicidality. So a series of the questions actually asked directly about suicidal thoughts and suicidal actions. And you can see 14 of the officers we interviewed, or 4%, had acknowledged having thought about or engaged in suicidal behavior. We also like to note that these are most likely undercounts of the prevalence of these problems, because as we talked about in the case study piece, not just officers, but people in general are not as willing to admit their own mental health issues, especially in the context of interviewing with people they don't know very well. And so we expect that these are actually underestimates, but they are still pretty high numbers that you're seeing this problematic or clinically elevated symptomology for. Specifically, as you saw in the previous chart, about a quarter, or 1 in every 4 of the officers who work for the department self-reported symptoms consistent with at least one psychological distress outcome, whether that was anxiety, anger, PTSD, or depression. Crucially, almost 5% of the officers we interviewed in the department were at risk for suicide. That's a pretty concerning number. That means that they were at risk for suicide within the past 6 months at the time we interviewed them. And very crucially, and this will become important in all of the work we do from here on out, those officers who personally knew officers who died by suicide are significantly more likely to experience psychological distress themselves, including suicidality. And so this was a key finding, no matter controlling for every other factor. Personally knowing someone who died by suicide was a key predictor of the psychological distress outcomes. So here, the next question we asked is what does predict mental health, these adverse mental health outcomes? As I mentioned, suicide proximity, or how close you were to someone who died by suicide, is a significant predictor across all 4 of the mental health outcomes. So those who knew an officer who died were significantly more likely to exhibit symptoms of anger, anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Work-family conflict was also a predictor across all 4 mental health outcomes. So those who reported experiencing more work-family conflict in their lives were significantly more likely to exhibit all 4 types of symptoms: anxiety, anger, depression, and PTSD. That's crucial because, as we mentioned in the case study part, the interaction between work and family was often very prevalent in the cases of the officers who died. It's also very prevalent in predicting mental health outcomes for officers who work in this department. And then thirdly, departmental discipline was a key predictor across 3 of the 4 outcomes. So those who reported having faced departmental discipline at some point were significantly more likely to exhibit symptoms of anger, depression, and PTSD. This is crucial as well because departmental discipline was emerged as important in the case studies as well for several, not all by any means, but several of the officer suicides. And as we mentioned, half of the officers had been under investigation. It turns out that in the second part of our study, departmental discipline is actually a key predictor of mental health outcomes for the officers that we interviewed across the sample. We also asked specifically about help seeking, having learned from the families about the reluctance of officers to seek help. And as we anticipated following those interviews, there was a reluctance to seek help even when people desperately needed it. So here we specifically asked, how likely are you to seek help if you were severely depressed or suicidal? So the high end of mental health distress. And as you can see, 16% admitted that they were not at all likely to seek help, even if they were severely depressed or suicidal. 29% indicated that they were somewhat likely, and just over half said that they would be very likely to seek help. This is actually quite a change from our stress study. So there may be a positive impact or positive lasting impact of officer suicides, and the officers are now more likely to say they themselves would seek help than they were in our previous stress study. In terms of seeking help for themselves, and this will be crucial for departmental sort of considerations going forward, officers reported that they were very unlikely to go to the EASU to seek help for themselves. So as you can see there, only 8% of the officers we interviewed identified the EASU as a resource that they would be willing to reach out to if they needed help. Those who were willing to seek help said that they would most likely go to their family or friends. About 20% said they would seek professional help outside of the department. 14% flat out said they wouldn't seek help of any kind, neither family, friends, professionals, nor the EASU. And then about 11% indicated that they would both talk to their family and seek help outside of the department. Crucially, this actually switches when you ask about seeking help for others. So when we asked, would you seek help? What would you do if you were to seek help for others? Almost all the officers indicated that they were willing to do something. There was 3% said they would do nothing at all, that it wasn't their business to interfere in the lives of others. But the remaining officers all reported a willingness to do something to help the other officers if they were worried. And they were most likely to say that they would reach out to the EASU or a supervisor along with helping them themselves. And so those were the two key things that they said they would do. You can see that quite a number said that they would do both things. They would try to help them themselves, and then they would also make outreach on their behalf. And then finally, about 3% had something else they would do, which was typically help them seek religious advisement or something other than professional help or internal resources. But this is positive in that the department could actually capitalize on this willingness of officers to seek help for others. It does seem like they're more willing to seek help for others than for themselves, at least in our data. So once we had these findings, this is how this led to our newest study. As I mentioned, we actually interviewed 45 new recruits in addition to the 319 officers from across the department. And here you see some of the answers to those questions, like how do you know that officers don't come in with all these anger and anxiety, PTSD type problems. And here you can see some pretty important differences between the groups. So among officers who had worked for the department for some time, those same numbers from the previous slide, about 1 in 4, expressed or was showing symptoms of anger, anxiety, PTSD, depression, or suicidality, but the numbers were much, much lower among new recruits. So it wasn't that they had none of these problems, but it was not nearly as pronounced. And so this we used actually later on to say that, we can't say what happened when or what order these things come in, but we would like to begin to find out. And so we used these comparisons here to make the case for our newest study, which I'll talk about at the end. This actually compares the random sample to the purposive sample of close friends of the officers who died. So in that purposive sample, or the group of what we called volunteers, were 34 people who we knew to be very close friends with one of the officers who died. And this is important because this is where you actually see in the red how much more prevalent these symptoms are among so they're pretty prevalent among the random sample, but they're even more prevalent among those who were close friends with one or more of the officers who had died by suicide. So this is where you're seeing the increase in the mental health distress among officers who knew someone who died by suicide. And this will have important implications for the department moving forward. We used our findings across both parts of the study to make some primary recommendations to the department. The most obvious is that they should be proactively addressing officer wellness, looking for and adopting programs and services to address the effects of the work on officers, rather than reactively offering services after a critical event. So a lot of what we learned from the officers is that a lot happens in the immediate aftermath of an officer's suicide, but then that dies down and until the next time. And then again, a bubbling up of activity kind of reactively rather than proactively. We also recommend that they contract with third-party licensed mental health professionals to supplement the work of the EASU. As I mentioned, the EASU is good to have around. I think officers in our stress study, a lot of the officers said the EASU is really helpful in terms of stress. They, as you saw, were pretty reluctant to go to the EASU for their own personal problems, but they were willing to reach out to the EASU on behalf of other officers, making it a useful resource. for the officers, but we also think that they really need to contract with third-party licensed mental health providers to provide an external confidential resource for the officers who are struggling in their occupational or personal lives. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Also, they need to the department should attend to the organizational stressors, the management supervision stresses that many officers shared with us that make the work more difficult. So the work is difficult to begin with, and many of the officers articulated that the work's difficult, but really some of these organizational stressors are even more difficult than the work itself. And the work schedules, the shifts, the forced overtime, as Carlos mentioned, forced overtime was a big problem during the period in which we did these interviews. And it was keenly on the officers' minds. And these negatively obviously impact their time with their family and their friends outside of work, and often cause some of the relationship problems that we were seeing across the case studies. We also recommend that they prioritize critical incident aftercare, so routinely providing external services to officers following acute violence exposures, but also offering bereavement time to officers who have known to being close to an officer who has died. In the case studies, we interviewed several officers who were very close friends. A couple of them had been offered some time off, not very much. Some of them were not offered any time off. As you can see, the impacts on officers who knew officers who had died were pretty profound, and therefore should be the department should probably be proactively trying to offer services to those officers, including time off or bereavement time. Also reforming the department's disciplinary processes. As I mentioned, the departmental discipline emerged as a key and recurring theme across both the officer suicides, where half of them had been subject to department discipline, but also as an acute stressor for officers still working there. And so we really recommend that the department promote fairness, consistency, and expedience in the disciplinary process. In some of these cases, officers tell us that they don't even really know what they're being investigated for. Sometimes they don't even know they're under investigation, or they hear from someone else that they're under investigation. And so more transparency, more fairness and consistency, and a recognition that this disciplinary process is pretty acutely stressful for officers and has actual impacts on their health and well-being. It would be key. And then finally, listening to the officers. So one of the things we learned through this work and all of our work with the officers is that they have some of the best ideas for changing the occupational culture. So you don't need people like me and Carlos to give you some suggestions or give the department suggestions around what to do. You could literally engage the officers in frank and open discussions about how to address the worst aspects of this environment. They know what the problems are. They have some pretty good ideas about how to improve them. And really, I think it would go a long way, as you'll hear in some of these quotes, in just giving them a space to say what they think should happen, and to sort of talk about the work and the way that it impacts them. And so we end actually with a series of quotes from the officers in the second half interviews. We asked every officer we interviewed, in your opinion, what can or should be done to address CO well-being within the Massachusetts Department of Correction. And there were, just as there are themes in the focus groups with the supervisors and the administrators, there were some really prominent themes in our interviews with our 440 officers that we interviewed. And those included proactively addressing officer suicide, supporting the officers. I should bold that was key. Addressing some of the inequities in staffing and scheduling, reducing the stigma of seeking help, and enhancing confidentiality through providing external sources for the officers to go to for outreach. And so we conclude with some of the representative quotes from those interviews. In terms of suicide prevention, an officer noted that they really need to address the rate of suicide, recognize that it's been increasing, and come up with some solutions to decrease it. Again, this officer points out that the department is reactive, not proactive. And so we recommend here that they, as we mentioned, focus extra attention on those who have been close to officers who have died, because we can see that that is a pretty strong predictor of psychological distress. Officer support, we had so many quotes that got at this notion that the department needs to be more supportive of the officers. A couple of particularly good ones: just be kind, it's not easy. We get paid decently, but it comes at a price. It would be easier if we were respected. it should be also be easier to get time off because you miss so much of your family life that you start to get resentful. Another officer pointed out the morale was terrible. People are spending so much time here, it's destroying their lives at home. Again, connecting back to the case studies where we heard many of these same things across the case studies. We should be able to express our concerns and suggest things that we can do to improve the culture. Sometimes the administrators don't understand the aggravations and problems we deal with. Another officer said, just treat officers as people, as human beings. It's important to talk to people, ask how they're doing. Management doesn't talk to staff unless they're yelling, berating, or disciplining. So again, actually just talking to people, listening to people was a very common theme. Another officer support quote, guys are disgruntled. They don't feel enough attention's being paid to critical issues. They just don't feel like enough time or any time is being dedicated to them. So again, our research team recommends, based on many of these interviews, that the department seek officer input, but not just seek the input, be responsive to the needs and concerns of the officers that work in the department. Shift staffing and scheduling came up a lot. Again, this was during a period of a lot of overtime, a lot of mandatory overtime. Very frequently, the way the scheduling works means that you're stuck on a terrible schedule for years until you get some seniority. And many of the officers said the department should move to a rotating schedule, or a schedule that allows people to have time off on the weekends periodically. Here's a couple of those quotes. We should go to a 4 days on, 2 days off, so that you could have a weekend every once in a while. I would like to note that none of the officers were saying they should never have to work weekends. They were arguing for scheduling that allows people to have some work, some time with their families on the weekends, while recognizing that this is a 24/7 operation that needs to be staffed. So again, they were not being unreasonable in the request that they shared with us, but more wanting to recognize that this shifts can be quite challenging in the scheduling as well. Again, another quote, I think it would be helpful to have a rotating schedule, let the young guys off at least a weekend a month. It can wreck relationships, this schedule. Again, giving the officers a week off in the summer if they could figure out a way to do it. So our recommendation is that the department actually adopt a rotating schedule for all new classes of recruits going forward, not to suddenly change the way in which they schedule, because a lot of people worked many years to get the seniority that they currently have and to get the schedules. And we do realize that would be a significant hardship on those officers, but more to change it going forward and allow an opt-in for current employees who are wanting to opt into this new rotating schedule, more like you would see in policing or in nursing or other 24/7 types of operations. We also recognize that the department actually is not adverse to considering scheduling, but that the union would have actually expressed to us that they would have a problem with this in terms of shifting the way in which it's scheduled. So we do recognize this will be one of the more uphill battles, but probably one of the most important when it comes to minimizing that work-family conflict, and something that the department should definitely work with the officers and the union to figure out in the future. As we move forward. Addressing the stigma is also huge. As the officers themselves noted, the stigma has to go away. It's a real thing. You can't always be rough and tough. Have a little more care and compassion towards one another. You don't have to like the people you work with, but you have to respect them and respect that we're all doing the same job. We all want to go home. And so here, in terms of addressing the stigma, we recognize that will take time, but the officers recognize it as well. And here we actually recommend that the department recognize the reluctance to seek help for oneself and build on the officer's willingness to seek help for others. So build outlets and avenues for both, not only other officers, but also family members who have concerns, to seek help for officers that won't leave them feeling like they might be compromising their friend or loved one's work, for example. That would be a nice starting step for addressing the stigma in the department. The stigma is also intimately tied with this problem of confidentiality and trust. Some of the officers said, we just need to allow people to talk about what they're going through and how they're feeling without being judged. Across the department, there was problems with trust and confidentiality from the perspective of the officers. This officer said, if the department came to us and said something was confidential, we wouldn't believe them. There's a bit of a trust issue between the COs and the department. here we recommend, again, as I mentioned, EASU for general officer support and kind of stress management, because those are officers and they do sort of have walked the walk and can relate to officers. But for critical incidents, for acute crises, for psychological distress, really investing in external resources that the officers might be more willing to use would be important. Again, these are just some of our many recommendations that result out of this work. We have been busy working on sort of running analyses on all the data we collected over these past 3 years, 4 years, and also publishing from these. But we'd like to end with an acknowledgement that we couldn't do this work without the correction officers and the families, friends, and staff who contribute to this work. And we'd like to dedicate this presentation and this work more generally to the memory of officers who had died by suicide and to their families and friends who live with that pain every day of their lives. And so we would like to, again, offer our thanks and our appreciation for the department letting us do this work, for the officers who are willing to participate in the hopes that other families don't have to go through what these families went through. In terms of questions, again, we hope to do this live in person and still hope to do this live in person at some point. But on this final slide, I've included our email for this study specifically, costudy@northeastern.edu. That email will come directly to the research team. It is an email for the research team. And I also wanted to make everyone aware of our website on correction officer safety, health, and wellness that really covers not only this study, but our former stress study that we worked on, and also our newer study, which focuses on new recruits. Everything that we publish, all the presentations that we give, including this one, will be publicly available on this site. And we really like to make it publicly available so that the officers can access our research and our findings without having to go through the department. You can get it straight from Northeastern through this website or through outreach to us at any time. For those who are interested, I'll just mention this CO suicide and well-being study did lead to yet another study of the officers of the Massachusetts Department of Correction. But this one really focusing on answering that key question, what is it in the occupational and personal lives of these officers that leads to psychological distress and ultimately suicide risk? And so in 2020, just last year, as we finished the officer suicide study and began to publish our early results, we also wrote another grant to the National Institute of Justice to study the careers of correction officers over time. In this study, some of you have seen us back in the facilities again. We're interviewing new recruits from the beginning of their careers and sort of following them over time to see where and what ends up leading to some of these psychological distress outcomes, and trying to link those to either occupational stressors, trauma exposures, personal circumstances, or most likely some combination of all three of those, so that we can get at the causal mechanisms more directly. Because although we found quite a lot of relationships between psychological distress and work exposures and things like that, none of those are particularly causal. They just show that there's an association between those things, and understanding what comes first and how those develop is crucial to better understanding and addressing the problems of officer health and well-being. So you'll see us around. We'll be working with the department for the foreseeable future, especially with the new officers. We're always happy to talk to anyone about our research, and I'll encourage you to reach out if you have any questions, comments, concerns, and encourage you to read the work that we publish from here on out and the presentations that we give. Thank you for joining us today or for watching this Zoom presentation of our findings. And again, we hope to be able to present this to officers in person at some point in the future. But in the meantime, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks so much. We appreciate it. And we appreciate all the assistance that we get from you as officers. We realize this is not easy. These interviews are not easy. And so we would like to thank you, whether you interviewed or not, for your willingness to listen to us, to hear us out, and to contribute to this research in the longer run. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great night.